We're live here. So I'm here with my dudes. I always stream with guys. So I got my guys here. I've got Britton, who's to my right. Underneath me is Epic, and then diagonal is Rafe. How you guys doing?
I am doing all right. I spent all day reading a book that is all about entrails and palm trees.
Fun. Britton, what's up? Epic, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I just got out of church not too long ago. Now I'm about to talk about World War II. Should be fun.
Epic, how you doing?
Well, I kind of like really enjoyed. I actually only started reading this yesterday because I've been like reading. I've been like so busy, but I really enjoyed reading about World War II. In the past, I've read quite a little bit about it, but always from the European perspective and what was going down in France and Germany and Poland and but Russia even, but never from what was going on with the Japanese. So this was very interesting to read.
So the book we read was With the Old Breed by E.B. Sledge, and this was also adapted into the Pacific. So I think a few of us didn't get a chance to read all of it. So if you have not read it in the chat, it is based specifically on episode 1 is kind of like a hodgepodge of all the different people, but this book specifically is purely adapted in episode 7, 6, 7, 8, and 10.
Yeah.
Has a lot of parts of this. So the Battle of Pele.
Yeah, it's this and like
Okinawa.
Lecky's memoir, if I recall.
Lecky's
Yeah,
memoir, which is way more
doing
literary. And
inspirations.
I guess we'll get a little bit more into this. Memoir in 1980 or whenever this was published is not the art that it is now. Lecky was a little bit ahead of his time with Helmet for My Pillow. And kind of unfortunately for him, he was in one of the early campaigns, Guadalcanal, which is not really known at all. It might be lesser known than Peleliu. And then there's another one that I really enjoy, which I think is little known, called Red Blood, Black Sand, about Iwo Jima. So the battles mentioned in here are Peleliu and Okinawa, and we are doing this on March 30th because April 1st, which we couldn't get everybody together for, but that's fine. We're going to do it on a weekend. April 1st is the 80th anniversary of the quote invasion. It wasn't a very intense invasion. They were kind of just able to walk onto the island in Okinawa. But so I'm going to say the start of the Battle of Okinawa. So
That is true.
yeah. So
I thought I was about to say Iwo
personally-
Jima was pretty. It was more intense, I would say.
yeah, there
I think
were.
it-
I mean, when they were hit pretty hard on the beach of Peleliu too. But
Yeah,
Okinawa, I think they were already all like back and didn't want to hit them on. They, meaning the Japanese, were all
Yeah,
kind of
like,
like back
this
already.
and the Eastern Front, which was the Russians versus the Nazis. Those were the two like nastiest parts of the war. Like the Japanese were not playing around.
No, like the
I
start
think
and
it's
the
safe
end.
to
on
say
this
that
thing.
no one was actually playing around during that time.
Whoa,
Nah,
No,
but I
no,
feel
like-
like I feel like the Japanese were hardcore, man. They would literally crawl on their bellies with knives into
Yeah.
enemy encampments to, do some ninja shit. Like damn, man.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was
So
so.
what I'm
reason
saying is,
a
like,
lot of. Oh, go ahead, Bretton. I'm sorry.
It was particularly vicious in those two parts of the war. I'm not saying like I don't want to pretend like the war between the Americans and the Germans were like a cakewalk, but yeah, the Eastern Front and Pacific Front specifically, nightmarish.
I know almost nothing. I mean, I know about Stalingrad and all that. I know like 1 million people or 1 million of the Red Army died at Stalingrad. Didn't that part of the war end before the Western Front? Or I might be thinking of World War One.
The Russians got to Berlin first before the
Yeah,
Americans did.
So it ended. But
yeah.
So
It was a pretty close run thing. Like the Eastern Front was definitely collapsed earlier during World War One, but like, I mean, one thing that I kind of wanted to ask when we were talking about this is like, how many other like war memoirs have you guys read over the years? Is this like the first one you read? I mean, I know some of you have read, for example, The Things They Carried, which is, you know,
I've
obviously
read that.
Haven't read it.
Vietnam one. Um,
This this is one of the few that I've read. I read Night when I was in school. Just go ahead and say it, Rafe. I'm not going to say his name wrong again. Wrote that-
Elie Wiesel.
Okay,
Wiesel,
yeah.
which
I was
is
saying
in fact,
Elie Wiesel, and he's like, "What? What? Oh, okay, yeah."
well, it's you pronounce it like the animal weasel, which is in fact, you know, what it actually means in German. So there you go.
I don't speak German at all. I
No,
didn't
you
even
pronounce
know
it
how
like
to.
the English animal weasel as well. So that's the point.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even know how to say Mein Kampf, and I'm still getting comments saying, "Learn how to speak. Learn how to
Well,
speak."
that was pretty close actually. So you're good there. I have read both Storm of Steel, which is obviously by Ernst Jünger, and it's a terrible book. You shouldn't read it. And I've read All Quiet on the Western Front when it comes to World War One. And I think that's one of the things that is important to understand is
Is that a memoir?
well, it's a novelization of it's much more fictionalized, the same way that you can say like The Things They Carried is much more fictionalized in a lot of ways and more literary than anything else. It's technically a novel, but it's very much based on
Yeah, because I've read
Remarque's
that one,
life,
of course.
Remarque's experiences in the war as well. And I think when you
I've
read
read
those,
diaries, which aren't really memoirs, mostly on the
yeah,
Civil War. I read, these are both really good, called Rebel Private Front and Rear, which is like, I don't know if our two Americans or our two non-Americans know what the lost cause is, but it's very like the Confederacy was right. This wasn't about slavery. We were the brave ones, and
yeah, which is interesting because it does kind of come up in with the old breed when he talks about like how he's from the South and
you
how
didn't see this, Rafe. You didn't see this because Rafe is 2 chapters from finishing. They raised a Confederate flag over that mountain.
yeah, I know. I finished it. So
No,
yeah,
he finished
Not
it.
Rafe. I'm sorry.
I got to that point.
yeah. That's in chapter 13.
I have that.
What's this?
I have
What is
that
yeah.
dog-eared. Let's see. All right,
It's
here we
chapter
go.
13. It's breakthrough is the chapter title,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
14 is
So-
the one
America
beyond.
is a very weird nation, is all I'll say.
Well, I mean, the Civil Rights Act was not put through at this time, so he's from
Yeah.
Alabama. I'm a Southerner. Britain, I don't know if you consider yourself a Southerner or more like Midwest.
I
Britain's
mean,
in
technically
Oklahoma.
I am, but I don't really,
Yeah.
you know.
So no, I
You
am
won't
a
see me
Southerner.
you won't see me flipping around a rebel flag anytime
Well,
soon.
you won't see me doing that either, but I am culturally a Southerner through and through. I was raised in Dallas, very, very Southern town. So this is what we were talking about. So about mid-morning on 29th May, 3-5, which is his company, his regiment and battalion, attacked the Shuri, so the castle, with Company L in the lead and Company K, his company, and I following closely. Earlier in the morning, Company A, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, who were at Belleau Wood, by the way, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, had attacked eastward into the reins of Shuri Castle and had raised the Confederate flag. We learned that the flag of the Confederacy had been hoisted over the very heart and soul of the Japanese resistance. All of us Southerners cheered loudly. The Yankees among us grumbled, and the Westerners didn't know what to do. I think that just sums the U.S. up pretty well at times.
It does explain a lot, and yep, you're right. Obviously, the Civil Rights Act was still far in the future, and one of the things that like is often sort of like ignored is, of course, the fact that the army at the time was very much segregated, and black
World War
army
II was
members
the
are
last
not.
war that segregated.
Yeah, they were still officially black Americans were not allowed to be part of fighting units. They were, truck drivers and stuff, which is one of the interesting things about the Battle of Peleliu, because they had so much trouble with, of course, having reinforcements landing on Peleliu, that that's one of the few places where during World War II the army was the Marines in particular were forcefully integrated, because they just needed anyone who could still hold a gun to actually hold a rifle and go fighting, and, and that's like significant in that regard.
Peleliu was September 1944. It was this guy's baptism by fire, we could say. And there's the argument to be made that that was a very worthless battle.
I
They
always
took
remember it from Call of Duty World at War, because there's a mission where you fight at Peleliu, so that's how I know about it.
what game?
Call of Duty World at War.
World at War. Okay. So basically, what I
Which
gather
also
about
takes
it,
from this, the title is even mentioned in that game, because one of the characters says we're part of the old breed,
yep,
and then
the
jokes,
old
old,
breed
we're not even
is
out of our 20s.
yep, the old breed is the 1st Marine Division. They fought in the Banana Wars between World War I and World War II, and we're at probably the most underappreciated battle, I'm gonna say of all time, but definitely in World War I, called the Battle of Belleau Wood, which helped break through the line, and yeah, it basically broke the stalemate. So that's why they're called the old breed.
I think we should
But
probably not call it the Banana Wars, though, because what it is America doing imperialism on behalf of, well, the United Fruit Corporation and occupying places. It's not a banana war. It's very much America doing capitalism with guns, as a
we
Marine
still call it the
commander
French
Smedley.
Indian Parade. Like,
Yeah, I mean, we can all read some Smedley Butler and learn what he thought about, like, his involvement in
Yeah.
those specific actions, which I highly recommend. Good guy.
I feel like if I had said that, nobody would have known what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't know the truth when it comes to history. I think a lot of people don't even know what that was all about. But anyway, so that's the reason
Good
this
old
is called the
imperialism.
old breed. And I think now, in modern times, we only have 3 Marine divisions. They got up to 6 during Peleliu. My grandfather was in the 3rd Marine Division, so he was not at not Peleliu, Okinawa. They got up to 6 Marine divisions in Okinawa,
Yeah.
and my grandfather was in the 3rd Marine Division, so he wasn't at either of these battles. He was at Guam and Bougainville.
Okay.
So 2 different battles.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, in a lot of ways, why the Pacific Theater is sort of like seen as particularly brutal, and I personally think that it's kind of difficult to talk about, like, graduation in brutality when we're talking about war. But I think in a lot of ways it is, because it is very different from what sort of like the common understanding of war was at the time, right? Like, because you have American, especially, you have the United States very much being, at least culturally, a European country in a lot of ways. And European warfare is, the kind of thing you see during World War One. It's the kind of thing you see during the Crimean War. It's the kind of thing you see during Napoleon and so forth. It's very clearly, broad battlefields where you can maneuver and do all of these kind of things. And World War II in the European theater does very much look like that. But like the Pacific campaign in particular, the island hopping, a lot of like the jungle, the vegetation is very, very different to what people expect war to be, because it's not, you march with like 10,000 people over a field and then you shoot at someone else. It's a very different kind of battlefield. I think that is what led to the image that it was far more brutal than anything else, because it is so different from what we expect war to be in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, like the Eastern Front, that was just a blood feud. Like, you invaded my country, we're gonna fuck you right back, basically. If you don't mind my French.
I think
Pacific was a freaking horror
One of
movie,
the
though.
things unique about, I think, the Pacific too is we never got to Japan, so we never really invaded their country except at Okinawa, which I think was just like a territory with civilians. Like, the United States were like in France, in Belgium, in Holland. We were not ever in Japan.
Yeah, that's true. But I think like for the most part, why this war feels so brutal in a lot of ways is that it is a very different kind of fighting from that sort of like cultural image that we have of warfare. Because going in small groups through like through jungle, doing this specific kind of thing where you need Marines for, right? That's kind of where Marines as a specific like style of army kind of excel in a way that you don't need Marines to cross like for the Battle of Kursk. What you need for that is like thousands and thousands and thousands of tanks, and then that's a different kind of warfare in a lot of ways. And the Marine style warfare feels different. This being small groups that creep through like jungle and then do that. It's a different approach to warfare, and it feels culturally different. And that, I think, leads to why people see it as very brutal, and it kind of obviously prefigures what happens during Vietnam in a lot of ways.
I mean, another reason too is just the nature of the enemy. I
Mm.
mean, the Japanese, there's a scene in here on Peleliu where they come by a dead guy and he's been mutilated and he's got his penis in his mouth by the
Ugh.
Japanese. That's just how brutal they were. They
I mean,
Uh,
like, I feel like the Japanese had like a certain kind of like viciousness to them. Like they were the suicide bombers, the what they kamikaze bombers,
Mhm.
like the thing in
Sometimes.
the knife where the night where they come to like assault your people. Like I've read like an old memoir. It was written by a Korean, and in that one they were talking about like how the Japanese tortured people. Like they'll hold them over, like they'll dink them into like hot pots of like boiling water and just like watch the skin fall off. And like the Japanese, I feel like were especially brutal. And when it comes to just that code of conduct of you can't of honor and like not the Japanese culture that's very very attached to like honor and like do your family proud and your emperor, that kind of mentality. I feel like they took it to like a new level of viciousness. And I feel
mm.
like even when they were training in the Marines, and the other guy was telling them like, you're back in the US, we tell you not to kick someone in the balls, but with these Japanese, man, you better kick them in the balls before they kick you in the balls. Like there was a visceral like quality to the to Japanese warfare that I feel like was reflected very well in the book.
I don't want to defend the Japanese Empire, not by a long shot. They did insanely cruel shit, especially when you go to like Manchuria and you look at like say the
Oh
rape of
yeah.
Nanking and all of that stuff. Like,
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, they did incredibly fucked up shit. But like, I read that part with the mutilated corpses, and I'm like, and set aside like the underlying homophobia that is sort of like in the shock that they had like their dick stuffed in their mouths, and I'm like, that is shocking to you. Like, soldiers have done this kind of shit for ever and ever and ever, and you can find reports of like people doing the same kind of stuff on the Western Front, and I'm pretty sure you can on the Eastern Front, and I'm pretty sure you can find reports of American soldiers doing the same fucking thing as well. And that's sort of like one thing that I find interesting in the book when we look at like it as something that Sledge wrote years later from his notes, as sort of like a way to explain to his family. I mean, that's what the foreword says and all of that, like to explain why he was the way he was, and sort of like coming to terms with the traumatic experience of war. And there is that level where he goes like, well, war sucks and everything, but there is like esprit de corps, and we as Marines we did specific things that kind of. I'm like, how much of that is him rationalizing the fact that people around him did similar things? But you have the guy breaking the gold teeth out of the like a living man's, the still living soldier's mouth,
Yeah,
and it's like,
yeah,
how is
yeah.
that less vicious than taking a corpse and stuffing its dick in its mouth? Except, of course, for the homophobia that is underlying the whole thing.
What
I
about what about the soldier that would hold his piss and then wait until he saw a dead Japanese and then pee in their mouth? Like,
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
idiots.
Exactly. Like war is fucked up, and people
It's
do incredibly fucked up things in war. That's kind of the point.
That's
One of
that's
the
that's
other
why I
unique
say like the
things.
Pacific is just as vicious as the East. Like it felt personal. Like it wasn't just like. Also, I think Raph, you're right when you say like there was also that was a different ball field that they were playing in.
Mm. And I
Sorry,
think
man, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
yeah.
One of the interesting things too is that the Marines never really saw, at least in the first division, and the third they definitely did because they took back Guam. But up until Okinawa, they never really encountered civilians.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that helped lead to the brutality of it against each other.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like, we got to protect these civilians from war. It was just like they could go all out. And that's one of the reasons they call Iwo Jima the perfect battle, because there were absolutely zero civilians on
Yeah,
that
same for
island.
Peleliu, right? Like Peleliu
Yeah,
is also
Peleliu.
just military. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think Sledge really does say that one was more brutal than Okinawa as far
Yeah.
as fight, like the terrain, and kind
Yeah.
of sounds like he almost preferred the mud over the sharp coral and not having water, but I don't know.
So I don't really fully understand this the strategic importance of Penelu. Is that how it's pronounced?
There was
But
no
like,
strategic importance. It was basically Douglas MacArthur wanting to take the Philippines first because he was still pissed that he lost the Philippines, and MacArthur
Yep.
being a bit of a massive dick, to put it mildly,
so
swinging said massive dick around, and he
Yep.
wanted Peleliu to be cleared to have sort of like, because it was an airfield, and he thought that the Japanese might use that to prevent him from taking back the Philippines.
Yep.
As it turns out, he was wrong about that.
yeah, but like, what? So why did the Japanese defend it so hard?
Because that's what they do. That's
No. The argument, so the strategy of the
I think it was
Japanese
part
at
of their
that
code, if I remember right. But Raf, you
No.
probably know more about it than I am. So
the underlying, the long-term strategy at that point in the war is that the Japanese high command, in a lot of ways, they knew that they were slowly losing that war. And the main thing they wanted to prevent is, in fact, an invasion of the home islands, right? So what they do is they defend every single fucking island as much as possible, in the hopes that the US will go, well, if they're defending these meaningless islands this hard, attacking, like invading actual Japan will be absolutely impossible. So we'd better actually, come to terms with them and allow them some form of like a peace treaty or whatever. And that's sort of the idea. That worked up to a point. The Americans were clearly not exactly thrilled with the prospect of of invading Japan, but they did have like nukes, so that kind of changed the whole like argument, and that's kind of where the whole thing failed at the end of the day. But the idea was to make every island as hard to take as possible, so that Americans would, allow Japan to, capitulate with better terms than it finally did. Right? That's kind of the idea behind it.
So it was that important to create that impression of
Yes.
like, wow, that
Yeah.
so many lives
Mhm.
so uselessly, like, oh my god, that's
Kind of
incredible.
reminds me of
backfired on them though. Like when we
Hmm?
dropped the bombs, I think that's the reason we did it. We
Yeah.
But the
wanted to
bomb
prevent the
was
invasion of Japan.
because, oh, so the bomb was dropped because America were like, fuck that, we don't want to go in there.
Yes.
pretty
That's
much.
the point. That's kind of the point.
Holy
You can
shit.
argue that.
I
You
don't know whether to respect that or just be like, yo, what the fuck? Like,
I think
Okay. First of all, I know that numbers can do anything if you add the right variables. I have seen calculations saying that preventing the invasion saved like 20 million lives or something, which I don't know, just way more, like exponentially more than were lost dropping the bombs. And while yes, that was a terrible thing, ending the war was not terrible. Ending the war was the right thing to do. And yes, it had terrible consequences. We had to do something terrible in order to end the war. But I think there's pretty good evidence. He only talks about the first bomb. The fact that they didn't surrender immediately after we dropped the first one, I think is really indicative of just.
I mean, there's a lot of like discussion around the whole nuke thing. I mean, if you look at it, the firebombing of Tokyo killed much more people than the nukes actually did. And there's an argument that Truman did not have to drop the nukes, but kind of wanted to also as sort of like a sort of signal to the Soviet Union as like, hey, we have these bombs now. Sort of like there's like doing two things, and there were like different options on the table to further attack Japan. Some of them were like firebombing and possibly a ground invasion. Some of them were just firebombing. There were lots of like different ways how this could have gone, but and dropping nukes was one of them that had the added benefit of like signaling to the Soviet Union that America did have nukes now, which did work out really well in that clearly the Soviet Union did totally never ever try to also develop nukes, but
Yeah. Yep.
wow.
That
it's complicated, right?
it is complicated, but at the end of the day, Epic, we dropped the bombs to prevent the invasion of Japan.
Yeah. No, like I don't like when I look at it, it's something that is tragic that also is seemed like it was necessary, and like I don't really have any qualms with that, but it's just like, damn, it's like the Japanese like really put up a fight. They really put up like a fight, like, you know.
Yeah, I mean, in that regard, the Japanese defense of Peleliu and Iwo Jima was clearly successful in that it had the effect of, like, you know, scaring the US away from having a ground invasion of Japan. It worked in that way. It did not work in the way they thought it would, because, you know,
They didn't think they would
lost.
make a bomb that
Uh,
could literally.
but
flatten
the
city.
bomb was like almost like a last minute thing that like was figured out. It wasn't like that variable wasn't there for like the Japanese to consider, like, well, they could
No,
just
no
drop
one
a
knew
bomb,
about it
you know.
really.
So it's
Yeah, but-
like,
yeah.
yeah.
So there were a few things we could have done to try to prevent the invasion. And I think if I'm sitting there in that control room, we drop the first one and they're just like, nope, we're still gonna fight. I think I'd be freaking out a little bit.
Yeah, I'd
Well, I
be
mean,
like, oh
it's
my
not
God.
like they.
When
I
are
think
they gonna get it?
No, there is a lot of like stuff that you can look into if you're really interested in that. The problem is that the command structure within both the Japanese military
Yeah.
and the military government, which the military dictatorship, which is basically what Japan was under at that point, there was a lot of like infighting between different factions that kind of, you had a lot of people that were already like, yeah, we're gonna fucking capitulate immediately. Even before the first bomb was dropped, they were already like on the verge of capitulating. But it's because you have these like very sort of like different factions fighting with each other. It just took a while for Japan to find someone who was, you know, had enough power to actually convince the emperor to actually make that statement, or force the emperor, or whatever you wanted to call it. So it just took longer than anyone thought, because Japan was a mess at that point.
So one thing I don't think Sledge really talks about a whole lot in this is the emperor and why they were in such defense of their emperor. They thought their emperor was God, and not just like from God, a disciple. They thought their emperor was God, and that's what Imperial Japan was all built about. So that
Yeah.
definitely, I'm sure led to I mean, how how else do you get someone to fly a plane into a boat? Like, how else do you get people to blow themselves up unless they think it's their duty to an all-powerful being who knows their intentions in their head? So I
I
don't know
feel
if it
like
was honor, if
I
it was fear, or
I feel like if you look into Japanese culture, like there are people like their culture trains them about like a lot about like sacrifice, a lot about honor. And I feel like, you know, I'm sure the emperor thing would have played a part, because you're like your god is basically, you know, maybe like has a need of you and all of that. But Japanese culture in and of itself is very, very very you know, what's the word I'm looking for, very very
altruistic.
myopic. Yes, very very myopic, very very myopic in the realms of you know, doing your duty, kind of like having like a role to play. And they think more of themselves as a community and a society than as an individual, which is like different from like Western like understanding of like the individual is the most important. It's like, what can you do for future generations? What can you do for your emperor? What can you do for your family? What can you do for your tribe, for your clan, you know, for your shogun? Like, just the Japanese culture is very different.
I think it's like several layers to this. Like, on the one hand, I totally get why Sledge is not getting into this, because Sledge is very, very deliberately writing as a grunt. He's in the front. He does not give like anything. He does not talk about any Japanese motivations.
No,
Yeah.
because he's
The
cannon
Japanese are basically completely opaque to him. He just doesn't care, or doesn't need to talk about that, because his experience, the experience he tries to write about, is what it is on the ground. And I'm pretty sure he's not alone in that. You know, most Marines on the ground on Peleliu or in Okinawa did not actually think about too much about that kind of stuff, because that level of thinking is not something that you have like the time and leisure to
Yeah,
engage in,
yeah,
right?
yeah. It's more
My dad
about
did a lot of my dad did a lot of business in Japan, and he told me that my grandfather was like, even in the 90s, not happy with my dad going back to Japan.
Yeah.
So
so
one
it's
thing
like,
Go ahead.
No, to Ralph's point that like he was thinking as a grunt, like I feel like a lot of you can tell that um when he's writing this, a lot of the stuff he's talking about it from a perspective of like hindsight, like hindsight, and trying to articulate emotions and like describe the experiences.
Yeah,
But at the time you would imagine that it was all about surviving the next second. It wasn't
yeah,
about like thinking or like considering motivations and all of
It's like,
that stuff.
how
And
do these
he
people
himself,
feel? Like,
yeah, like,
they're
and he
trying to kill
himself,
me.
he himself like said that like that two things. The first one was that when he got the chance to become a commander, he was like, yeah, he doesn't think he can send people to kill themselves. He's really like stamping himself as that like
yeah,
front man. And the second thing is that like they when you create a label around like a people, it's like kind of the thing with racism as well. But like once you look at someone and you look at them as the devil, like these guys are just like the scum of the earth, like like
yeah,
whatever terms they would use at the time, yips I think it was, but like or nips,
Mhm.
but basically he just encapsulate their whole experience or their whole like mentality or their entirety into this like closed off idea of what they are. And any further consideration of their motivations or
yeah.
choices is just like not important to you.
And I mean, to be clear, that is what like happens in every war, because in order, like, humans are not like most humans are not able to kill someone on command or in cold blood. That's like what military training is all about. Is like actually making people bring people to the point where they're able to kill other people, because that's not something we do normally. And the dehumanizing of your enemy is something that everyone has ever done. That
Dehumanizing.
happens when you see like what Germans think about or say about Russians or other parts of like the Soviet Union. When you see what it has happened in every single war. That's just like what you do to rationalize to yourself that you're killing these people. You have to other them. You have to dehumanize them. That's just like what happens.
One thing, we were talking about him being a grunt. At the beginning of the book, he talks
Mhm.
about how his parents are telling him, no, don't do that. And
Yeah.
he's not listening. And so, I mean, yes, he was like a 20-year-old kid, but I'm like, they told you. Like, they told you it was going to be
Yeah,
bad. You probably should have listened to your parents and brother. And when he didn't,
yeah,
it goes south. And I,
yeah.
Look,
I
I
found
get it.
his
I'm
When
voice a
that
little
thinking when
rude.
you're
officer,
young, you don't want to listen to your parents. You
I
know?
I
yeah,
found
It's
his
like,
no,
voice a little bit whiny.
it's like,
Instead,
fuck you.
because he was just constantly telling us, like, you know, I was scared. I had panic. I'm a coward. I just want this to end. And I'm sitting there like, we get it. Like, just tell us. You don't need to tell us that you were scared. Like, if bombs and you're getting shelled in your little foxhole, like, we can
so
kind of
I,
gather that
I,
you're scared, dude. Just like,
Amanda,
yeah,
Amanda, you're. I feel like you're looking at it from like a literary perspective, like
a
you're
little bit.
writing. Maybe you're repeating, but like I feel like it that level of trauma and escalating levels of fear. And he wasn't just saying he's scared, he was
Mhm.
also like describing the escalation of the fear. There was a point where like his fear was about, oh shit, like I've been so lucky so far, there's no chance that I'm going to survive tomorrow. There was another time when like the ship that was going to take them away from the
Okay,
island
I'm gonna get a
was
drink
going
real
to
quick.
arrive the next day, and he's like, oh, there's no way I'm going to survive. So it's like I get your point from a literary perspective, because it gets very repetitive and
And
whiny.
I've
But
yes,
like
and I've
his
tried to preface this
experience,
with it's not the art it is now. I've seen people write about, serious trauma as well, and it's more literary. But again, this was like 1981. He's writing about memories he had 35 years ago. Like, I'm trying to keep that in mind. But then the
I
last
think,
like 60, 40 pages are just him complaining. And it was hard to get through the end.
but I think that's kind of the point, really, because
Yeah.
like if the goal of the book, of him writing that book, was to explain to his friends and family why he's like a traumatized fucking mess,
Yeah.
then trying to explain that alienation that a lot of like soldiers have, like after coming back from a war, not being understood by people because you've gone through something that. Then you kind of need to hammer that point home. You know what I mean? Because the public image of the war, World War II, especially like after Vietnam, right? World War II is the last good war that the US fought, so to speak, right? The one you can be proud of because you defeated fascism, and I'm together with the communists. Let's not forget that. But it's a war you can be proud of, whereas both Korea and in particular Vietnam are absolute fucking traumas. And he writes this in 81, right?
Korea, there was some goodness that came out of that, and that the US and South Korea became very true allies, and we were fighting. That was the last war, I will say, when the US was fighting for freedom. It just didn't go the way we wanted.
You mean the 30 years of military dictatorship in South Korea, right? That's freedom.
Well,
no, I'm not defending North Korea. I'm just saying that freedom is a very relative term when we're talking about Korea.
When we're talking about wars America has fought, that's as close as you get to World War II, with a war actually being fought for freedom.
So in terms of and again, I don't really know too much of the details, but like when I hear like America is fighting for freedom, I'm just like very cynic about it. Like that's like the propaganda. That's like your excuse, like the war in Iraq. Now, if you look at it, like, of course, in hindsight, we all know that there was nothing there, but it was about freedom and all of that stuff. I feel like it's just like a tag.
Not our freedom
at this point. Yeah, but
over
a fuel dispute.
I'm maybe not.
I remember right.
I'm maybe not the biggest defender of American military and imperial politics, but I would argue that, and I'm saying this as a German, like global fascism needed to be stopped. Germany and Japan needed to be, fought militarily. Yeah. And that shit had to happen, and America did actually do the right thing in that regard. You can argue about details and stuff, but America joining the war maybe a couple of years too late and all of that. That shit had to happen.
With World War II, there's no question that
who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side.
World War II is one of those rare wars where the Nazis were so bad that America and the communists are like, hey, I know we don't like each other. I don't like you. You don't like me. But these guys are fucking crazy. We gotta stop them before they start.
I heard this joke that I found really funny. Maybe it's not that funny, but it's funny. Okay, it's funny. That if Germany is the fatherland and the Soviet Union is Mother Russia, then World War II was just a big divorce, and America was the child that was caught in between. That's funny. I mean, not the best taste, but I read that and I found that hysterical.
I think. To bring that back, right? Like he's writing from the perspective of a grunt in that, like in hindsight, World War II is very much, mythologized in a lot of ways. And it is sort of like the good war and people fighting there were the heroes and so forth. And if you live through that and your experience is, well, basically months and months of trench foot and trauma and fear and whatever, you come home a fucking wreck because that's, kind of what happens when you're a soldier. And everyone is like, well, but you were like our World War II hero, so why are you a mess, right? You need to sort of explain your brokenness to people that don't understand that, because the image they have of you is the image of a hero. And you don't feel like one. I think what's interesting in that regard is that like World War I and World War II are sort of like a massive shift when it comes to war memoirs in general, like published war memoirs, because literary culture.
I love World War I poetry. Like, I don't like poetry in general typically, but the war poetry. Sorry, I was just getting an update about college basketball. But the war poetry that came out of World War I with Wilfred Owen and Anthem for a Doomed Youth, and then in Crimea we've got Charge of the Light Brigade. I think I might have approached this book wrong in that's what I had in my head. That's my experience with war.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though, right?
Because poetry is nonfiction. Poetry is nonfiction. Like
when I
Angels
saw
for a
on
Doomed Youth is nonfiction. So
But that's the interesting thing because like Sledge does quote a couple of World War
yeah,
One poets. He does quote Owens. He does quote my favorite Robert Graves, of course. And but my point is a different one. Like and I would not put the
cartoon.
Charge of the Light Brigade into that because the Charge of the Light Brigade is in fact like very much glorifying the fucking thing. Whereas you read something like
When it was
Dulce
a
et
Really?
Decorum.
debacle in real life.
What?
Yeah, he
No,
quote.
I
I
said
just turned to the
when it was a
page.
debacle in real life, the Charge of the
Yeah,
Light
but
Brigade.
you compare
Says
Charge of the
what?
Light Brigade. You compare Charge of the Light Brigade with something like Dulce et Decorum Est, right? And
Yeah.
you realize there's a massive shift, and I think that's what we're trying to get at with World War One. Is that first war where like lower ranks people like frontline soldiers had both the education and because of say mass culture as it has evolved, you can read like Walter Benjamin for that, I guess, made it possible for people without a lot of privilege to actually publish their thoughts on the war. You obviously have like memoirs and you have diaries and letters and stuff from before that, but like World War One is the first time where like actual soldiers on the ground from the trenches could actually write books and get them published. Before that, like all the stuff we get like published about war is always written by officers, by the nobility, by aristocrats and so forth. And that's the massive difference. And you see that with something like, say, All Quiet on the Western Front. You read, on the other hand, Storm of Steel by Ernst Jünger, who is very much upper class and an officer and so forth. His perspective on World War One is still a different one. And you move that to World War Two, and you have more people that actually have this, the thing we now think of as war fiction, the thing that, this book is, the thing that, say, the things they carried is this, like, very much the tropes that you then find in like military fiction and military fantasy, and Epic has already mentioned earlier, I think, Black Company, right? This idea that no one tells the grunts anything. We're like mushrooms. We're like kept in the dark and fed horse shit. You have all of these kind of things. The hatred for like officers because of that like underlying class difference and all of that
Oh
stuff.
yeah, in All Quiet in the Western Front, the new movie, I don't know if this is in the book. I haven't read the book since I was like 19. They call the
Really good book, though.
officers the fat pigs.
Mm.
Oh, right. Were you like, oh, so yesterday?
No, and I think that's important because that's a genre that only comes about with like World War One and World War Two, and you can, when you read something like With the Old Breed, I think you can see a lot of these sort of like tropes of war writing being developed and being very much established. Being very much established in that kind of writing. I think either consciously or subconsciously, Sledge is kind of feeding into that specific approach with a lot of the things he wrote, right? The way he describes things. And that's like where the trauma kind of stuff comes in. That's where the whole like stuff with his like officer. And I don't doubt that like his, what's his name? Isn't Mac or something the guy that pisses into people's mouths and does dumb shit like the smarmy East Coast kind of officer. Yeah, that's a lot of these tropes that are established there. This sort of like class difference between the grunts that are actually willing to do whatever it takes, and whereas you have like the rear echelon kind of people that are all unreliable and only take advantage of like the front troops. A lot of these tropes are sort of like established between World War One and World War Two because those are the first two wars where people from the sort of like lower ranks of the military finally have the ability to actually get their stuff published, and you can see this sort of like form in development there, I think.
One thing I want to kind of go off that we were talking about aristocracy. Sledge was a grunt, but he was also a rich kid.
Yeah, I know.
So that's why his parents are like, don't do this, you're gonna regret it. But there's in Rest and Rehabilitation, which we'll talk about in a second, where they put the Marines for R&R. But let's see, who is this? I was just a veteran from Gloucester. I kind of had my doubts about you, he's continued, and how you actually got into combat and stuff and hit the fan. Okay, one thing too, they weren't saying stuff. Like, this is very calm down. Like, he does not want his family to know.
Like his buddy Snafu. It's a situation novel, all fouled up, and I'm no.
So,
I was about to say,
your old man being a doctor, and you haven't been to. And, geez, okay. When stuff hit the fan, I mean, your old man being a doctor and you haven't been to college and being sort of a rich kid compared to some guys. But I kept my
Yeah.
eye on you and Pelelu, and by God, you did okay. You did okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is clear, and I think that kind of comes through. He is very deliberately painting himself, and when he's writing this, right, he already has like a PhD and was a teacher at like in biology teacher at like some college, right? He's an educated person, but he's very deliberately sort of like painting himself as part of the boys of the gang, right? You know what I mean? And I think that does sort of like overlay and paint and somewhat color the entire narrative in the way he's writing stuff. He's very clearly him trying to be part of the gang.
Yeah,
for sure,
and you can kind of like so it's like and this is, I know, like, this is, I know this is very super basic stuff, but then I always used to conflate prose with like poetry. I always conflated the both of them together. Prose basically more is like efficient writing, like how, what is the quickest way to communicate this message to people, versus poetry, which is flowery. The best writers combine the both very well, right? I feel like in a prosaic way, like the book does what it intending to do in communicating his trauma and like the viciousness and just how much of hell he was in, right? So in a prosaic way, like I can appreciate what he's doing, which is why I drew parallels with it with the Black Company, because the Black Company is kind of there, but then there's also like poetic aspects to it as well. But like in general, I feel like from a literary perspective, like the prose like is effective in like you could tell, it's like you could see, you could almost feel his personality, or like how he sees himself in the way that he wrote the thing, like, and he saw himself as a grunt despite his education and his privilege.
Yeah, I think that's important. Like, one thing that I found interesting, and I want to ask you guys, how many of you have in fact read Slaughterhouse-Five?
I have not.
Long time ago, but I've read it.
You read it, Epic?
No,
Is
I
this
haven't.
something?
I haven't.
Obviously, do that. It's an amazing book. One thing that I find really interesting though is Slaughterhouse-Five has a long introduction by Vonnegut where he talks about hanging out with his like another like veteran from World War II and talking about the war and stuff, and what him being a writer. Everyone is asking him like when he's writing about his time in World War II, and he's struggling with that. And his wife tells him, don't write a book about World War II, because no matter what you put into this, it will make other people go and join armies and go to war, because there's no way you can write fiction about war that does not make it sound attractive to at least
Glorious,
some people in one way or another. And that's why.
It's like that old quote: "You can't make a war movie," or it's like there's no such thing as an anti-war movie.
Yeah, that's basically the same. That's basically the same thing, and he talks about that, and that's why at the end of the day calls has a subtitle for Slaughterhouse-Five that is the Children's Crusade, because that's basically what it is. A lot of us like went to war because we thought we should, and and at the end of the day, on a personal level, it was a fucking mess, even though we did the right thing. And I find this interesting because while reading this book, and it obviously gets very, very graphic and in some of the details and stuff. Like I said, entrails and palm trees because that's kind of what it is. It still does have all these elements where you see that where you can find these moments where he clearly doesn't glorify war in any way, shape, or form, but makes it sound sexy despite himself. And I think that's something I find interesting, because the question is, and that's something I was wrestling with like 2 years ago, when I was trying to give like a presentation on like war fiction. I was comparing some World War I stuff with Slaughterhouse-Five and the things they carried, and you sort of that like straight up war fiction is not war fiction, like writing about war is unable to actually do that. In order to take away the glorification of war, you kind of have to move into the super real, into the surreal, into the fantastic in one way or another, which is why, say, Vonnegut does the thing he does with Slaughterhouse-Five, and which is why you have these surreal elements in something that O'Brien writes in The Things They Carried. Because if you try to be realistic, or not realistic, but like use realism to describe war, it will come across, because because of the sheer immensity, you will have to use superlatives. You will have to go into, what someone like, oh God, I can't believe I'm quoting Edmund Burke here, but like citing Edmund Burke, but like,
Don't like not a fan of Edmund Burke.
not at all. But I took a class in philosophy at university on his essay on the sublime and beautiful, and that's exactly what Burke would call the sublimes. That it's threatening and dangerous and unsettling in a lot of ways, but it is still grandiose, and it does have an attraction. And if you go for realism, or the language of realism in war, in writing about war, you will end up in the sublime, and that is attractive. And if you move away from that, you need to do that by entering, the surreal, the fantastic in one way or another. And that's just something I found really, really interesting and fascinating while reading about this book, that is trying really hard to be as real as it gets, right?
And everybody, we were talking, there's no such thing. It's like they're anti-war, and there's like, couldn't we say that for war itself? I mean, obviously I've never been in a war, but I've been in some very traumatic situations. And is there something beautiful we can get out of that, or is war just all pointless slaughter?
I
mean,
don't
my
think
grandpa
it's.
would
I
be
don't think
both.
it's. I don't. I don't think it's. I don't
Which he's
think. I
never
think.
proud of, but
I think over like for the right reasons. Now, the right reasons, that's like highly subjective, because if the Germans and the Japanese won the war, I'm sure they would have taught people that the Western world were the villains, and I don't know, different curricula right now.
I'm
But
meaning more
the
of like
point being,
small
my
moments.
point, my point just being that, like, for the right reasons, I believe a war should be fought, like for freedom, for instance, like from oppression, from like I feel like the greater ideals like exist, and for greater
I mean,
ideals, like
also
war should be fought.
just to keep your country if someone else is invading it, say in Ukraine or whatever, right?
Yeah.
No, I think there's a difference between war is pointless slaughter, and that is on the personal level. War is always pointless slaughter. On a grand political, global, whatever scale, there's like variations between pointless slaughter and slaughter with a point, right? Like,
Yeah.
defeating the Nazis was not pointless on a global scale, but for the individual Russian conscript in Stalingrad, sure, that was pointless slaughter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
There are
that's
some moments in this book, though, that he talks about with fondness, like when they're escorting civilians on Okinawa. There's the scene where this little kid and his mom
oh yeah,
he's begging
that
for
was
attention,
cute.
and then mom squirts breast milk in his face to get him to go away. Like, that's
Oh,
obviously
yeah.
something he remembers with fondness. So can we say it was all bad if there are moments and friends and
I
stuff
think
like that you glean from it, obviously in the midst of
Yes.
this horror?
Yes. On an individual level, I feel like it's all bad. On an individual level, like what it does to an individual and the individuals involved in the war, because you cannot compare that moment to, like, you can't put that moment beside the trauma of, like, falling in water and then rising and like wiping maggots from your body, and like you can't, like, eating bread and then your commander telling you, well, the beetles that are eating the bread, that's extra meat in your protein, in your,
Oh my God!
like,
The one part
like it's
the
like I
one
rather
part that got me, the most deflating part of this novel had to be, imagine this: you've been fighting for your life. Your dad writes you a letter. Oh yes, I'm gonna hear from my dad. I get to feel a connection from home. And then
Your
you find
dog
out your
died.
dog died.
oh,
Like, what a horrible, like,
that sucks.
that's exactly what you need when you're here. Like, why?
Well, at least he did not do the thing that is supposed to be doing at the moment where the dog dies, which is like take 2 handguns and just like kill everyone in really cool slow-mo stunts.
Yeah. It's just like, I can't imagine, like, how just disheartening would that be?
Mm.
You're
I don't even
fighting
know
the
why they
Japs,
told
you
him. They
you
shouldn't
get
have
left
told
at
him.
home, something you're supposed to be excited about. You read it and then you
I
find
gotta
out
say
your
though,
dog
Sledge's
It's
died.
like
dad is a
it's like
freaking hero.
it's
Like,
it's like his dad. It's like his dad was basically like, yeah, I know you have it hard over there, but we're suffering
Yeah.
too.
No, I don't think so. I think, first of all, just like a quick shout out to Alicia and Kadia, and also for actually being in the chat. And hello, and thanks for being
Yeah.
there. And I think to bring it back, it kind of does show the thing that that Sledge is trying to explain, which is that fundamental disconnect between being in that war and being at home. And clearly, if you're at home and you keep, you're the parents of your son who's over there in the war, and his dog dies on your watch, and it was like hit by a car, right? That was the thing.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's even worse.
And that happens to your son's beloved dog that was his best friend for like the last 10 years or
Oh,
whatever.
Bend is also
You
here.
think you think and you believe, and I would do the probably think and believe the same thing. It's like you need to tell him that because that dog is important to him, so he needs to know. And on the other hand, you don't know, like, if they hadn't told him until he comes back, like maybe he would have felt betrayed about not being told as well, right? Like there's no real answer, but I think it kind of shows that sort of like drift between like war being like one world and non-war being like basically a different world. There's an incredibly good quote about that in one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen books, and I can't get it together, but it's clearly about it's very much about the fact that, like, yeah, if you enter war, you're in a different world, and it's important to understand that, like, people who have not been in that world with you don't understand you, and you don't understand the people that that you've left behind, because you have changed universes basically, and I think that the episode with the dog kind of does show exactly that. The same way that letter he gets from like a friend who's like comes to Okinawa right at the end of the battles and like, hey, where are you? While they are all like, dying in like on that last fucking ridge, and his friend's like, hey, I'm gonna come visit you, and it's like you don't have that experience. And understanding that like some experiences sort of like actually set you apart, and that I think you can transfer that to all kinds of other like things that leave trauma with us, like whether it's surviving like a violent crime, surviving domestic violence, sexual assault, all of these things. If you have survived something, you are a different person because you have an experience that other people fundamentally don't have. And recognizing that, I mean, I guess like war just makes it very, very very clear and stark to see that difference. But it's something that happens in the smallest bits and pieces of our experiences, because we are all different, and sometimes something happens and we are a different person afterwards, and stuff needs to be renegotiated, I guess.
It kind of reminds me a little bit, what you guys are talking about. Of I had some friends, my friends at Talking Story the other day did a conversation about Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and
yeah,
it's kind of interesting that you bring that up because Conrad does a similar thing in that book, where at the end, Kurtz's widow asks him, what did he say before he died, and he doesn't tell her because it's kind of that similar. How would she understand what he saw?
Yeah, very much so. Oh, and hello, Bend. Very much nice.
Blood Meridian as well. What you mentioned earlier about when you talk about violence and war, you kind of go into another world in a weird way.
I think Blood Meridian tries to wrestle with that, and McCarthy does it in a McCarthy way. But it also once again shows about like what happens if you let people lose the thing that makes them human. Obviously, McCarthy being McCarthy and Blood Meridian being Blood Meridian, it goes down that whole like with a lot of energy, to put it mildly. But that general idea that if you are in such a situation, you lose aspects of what makes humans, right? And this is a wonderful quote in, I think it's Men at Arms by Terry Pratchett, where he talks about that that we are not.
I'm going to read that soon.
It's very much at the beginning. It's not a spoiler or anything. He talks about like how the fact that like being born human does not actually make you a fully paid up member of the human race. What actually does that is being bounced around by the Brownian motion of society, like having to interact with people of different backgrounds with different experiences and so forth, and being doing life in society is what actually makes us human. And if you take people out of that and putting people into war, into something like Palelio or Okinawa or whatever, right, does take you out of society, because military society, the Marines in that situation don't operate like human society, and you lose aspects of what it means to be human, because being human is something that we practice, it's something we do, it's not something we are in a lot of ways. And I think that's something the book shows in a lot of ways, how people, and he talks about that like specifically, right, when he talks about like how as soon as the Marines go back to the base, they shave and they dress well and everything is like, but if you're in combat, you suddenly look like an absolute monster. Like your hair is filthy, you're covered in grime and dread, you can't bathe, you can't wash yourself, you can't brush your teeth, and how that is sort of like, these are like physical signs that you are sort of like outside of what makes you human on a fundamental level.
Yeah, like having these experiences that make you negotiate ideals that you've held on to for so long, and like make up your identity is definitely something that would make you stick out like a sore thumb. And it's of course, like with these experiences, there are different grades to them as well. Like I feel like war has to be like the worst of them, because it's like just the stuff you experience, just the depth of experience in terms of understanding what human beings are capable of doing, like seeing human beings like do stuff like that, it has to change you. And also knowing that you're capable of doing that stuff. Like for instance, like in the book, Sledge talks about talked about never smoking, talked about how he one time he was so naive, he questioned the extra cruelty like some of the soldiers did. But then later on during the book, he has a point where he just says, what's the point? They are Japs and we should kill them anyway. Like it's like you can see the deterioration of his like civility and the person he was before the war started. So it's
he's like these deliberate like moments, right? The situation where he decides that he wants to also take gold teeth, and his friend goes like, don't do that, because if you do that, and he goes like, later I realized that actually he really saved me from like getting one step worse. And then you have people like that later officer that does all the dumb shit like shooting guns where he's not supposed to, and deliberately pissing into dead Japanese soldiers' faces and stuff like that. Like, and he recognized that those are people that have like where all the brakes are off, and being in that kind of extreme situation is that constant struggle of like keeping as many brakes on as possible. But on the other hand, to be an effective soldier, you need to take some of those brakes off, and that's kind of what training does, right? But he talks about that like a lot, when he goes like, well, boot camp was really helpful because it does sort of like prepare you to slip back into routines and not actually think about the things that you would normally think about if you're like a human being, and act on those impulses that have been drilled into you to overcome those breaks that we need to overcome in order to be functional soldiers. Because humans don't like killing other people. It's kind of hard to do that for most of us.
Yeah, it kind of cut back to one of the points that was made earlier about just how hard the Japanese fought for the islands that they were on. Again, that kind of reminds me of the movie Heart of Darkness, which is a loose adaptation of Heart of Darkness. And Kurtz is talking about Colonel Kurtz, the Kurtz stand-in from the books, is basically talking about what he calls moral terror, which is basically where he thinks the enemy acts as ruthlessly as possible in order to demoralize the other side into just quitting. It kind of reminds me of that. Which, I guess Asians are just great at that because, that's a Vietnam movie and we're talking about Japan in this.
I don't think Asians, and we should be careful with not using that specific term, right?
I'm not like being serious.
But I think it works in the same way the other way around, because what it is, it boils down to othering, and it boils down to racism, it boils down to cultural differences. And it's very easy for a mostly white, in this case, at least in World War II, American army to think of Japanese soldiers as inhuman, as other, because of all the racism, right? That has been drilled into, and then it works both ways. It's very easy for Japanese soldiers to think of white or black Americans as inhuman or the other, because once again of racism, because that happens both ways. But that's kind of what it boils down to, and it's the same thing once again in Vietnam, because you have like East Asian racism that has a strong and proud tradition in America ever since, a lot of Chinese people were exploited to the max to build railways, at least. And you could rely on that to sort of like work in both ways, right? You're scared of those people because that's part of like racism. You also think of them as lesser because that's also part of racism. And
I think I even read somewhere that like both sides were terrified of each other.
Oh yeah, of course.
I think even the Japanese were scared of the Americans.
Yeah, of course. That was my point. It's like it is racism that is at the core of this, but racism cuts both ways because Japanese people can be incredibly racist. So can white people. So can black people.
Isn't that how they justified the stuff they did in China? Which, like, I wouldn't, all the trigger warnings there. I mean,
Lord. Like I'm sure like maybe it's just like my experience of like what I've read, what I've exposed myself to, but like the Japanese were like brutal, man. They were brutal. They were like I read there's a book, I forget the name, but it was like a memoir of like the Korean Japan war and everything, and it was on some other level. And you would have to imagine that people that can literally cut open their bellies and watch their guts spill out because they have dishonored, like those guys, like if they can do that to themselves, then like I feel like they might have just been like, just mentally, they might have been an extra edge to their viciousness,
I'm from a country where we, where we did certain incredibly interesting, to put it mildly, experiments with twins and other. So I don't think Japan has
Germany was, but Germany, for instance, right? Germany was was more, that was not like part of their culture. It wasn't part of. Yeah, because I'm talking about seppuku, right?
Belly slitting, suicide ritual.
Yeah, like that's what, like the Germans, wasn't like the average German person, right? Didn't really, I don't think they knew about the stuff that was happening in the concentration camps. I feel like what happened after. Oh, they did, no. But like, but it wasn't like cultural. Like it wasn't cultural for them to be that callous towards something like that. But seppuku is like something that is taught in like Japanese family, Japanese cultures for years and years and centuries.
It's part of the samurai culture, if I remember.
Yeah, it's part of the samurai culture, and it was normal to see it.
Even did that.
I feel like
you know what I'm saying.
70s.
This army, the Japanese Imperial Army, they were more scared of just the feeling of shame than they were of dying.
Yes, like there's something extra twisted there.
I don't think there is something,
and I don't mean
twisted. It is different for each culture, of course, but I think it's dangerous to go and that's like one problem that we still have, because whether it's because of like racism or all kinds of other political situations that happened afterwards, the way that we think about Germany, Nazi Germany, and then like West Germany in particular, sort of like dealing with the Nazi heritage and so forth, is very different from like the way, especially the US sees Japan. Also, the way that Japan sees itself or saw itself. And there's a lot of like mythologizing and fetishizing of Japanese culture happening in a lot of ways. And don't get me wrong, like obviously the Japanese empire was insanely brutal and so forth. And yes, seppuku is a thing, and you have the kamikaze bombers, but there's a lot of stuff that kind of goes into that, and sort of like putting it on this sort of like pedestal and making it separate and different from, say, what Germans did. Like, that I think is dangerous, because look, I'm not gonna go like, well, at least we were we were worse or whatever. This is not a competition, but I
So
think
so
no,
so
I
let,
don't think
let,
we would ever
let
do
me
that.
let me
Or
make
is it
something
we can
very
get to
clear.
that?
Let me make something very
yeah,
clear. I do have a samurai sword. I love Japanese culture, and
yeah.
one day I would love to go there because I feel like to feel like home. Just all the anime and manga and like the history and all that stuff, and how cool I think samurais are. But like even in my admiration of like Japanese culture, like, and I'm not saying it in terms of like putting it in on a pedestal or any of that stuff, but the Germans, like the Germans, for instance, they were seen as pretty like, normal Europeans until like, the stuff happened, right? Like the Japanese, they've always lived in isolation. They isolated themselves for most of history, and because of that they were not very
Well, they're
inclined
also an
towards,
island.
they were also an island, and they were not very inclined towards like modern day civilities even for that time. So it's like I'm only recognizing how alien their culture was, like in terms of how like the seppuku, like, their great aversion to shame, which is also, even something that is still very prevalent today. But with the Japanese, there's just an extra sense of, I feel like, intrigue, not necessarily putting them on a pedestal, but just adding some historical context to like how they
I
isolated themselves and how they didn't expose themselves to other people, how they were just a very singular type
but
of like
and,
community.
and that's kind of what that's what I was trying to question here, right? Because the point is, you said Germans were seen as regular Europeans, and the problem there is that we're saying this from a Western perspective because we are. I'm German. You are living
Nigerian.
in Canada, you're
Canada.
Nigerian, but you're living in Canada, in once again a
Yeah.
Western culture, right? You guys are at the end of the day American, and there is sort of like a level of othering happening. That's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier when I said that we think of the war in the Pacific as more brutal because it is racialized in that specific way, whereas like the war in Europe, the European theater, whether it's the Western Front or the Eastern Front, like it's still by it is
I
happening
know
in
what
that
you
sort of
mean.
like cultural framing, right?
Well,
Hmm?
unless
I
it
feel
was
like
the
I know what
Eastern
you
Front,
mean. Whereas
because
when the Marines were fighting the Japanese looked different.
Yeah.
Whereas if you get like the airborne or just whoever was fighting the Germans, they looked
Yeah.
the same.
Yes.
It's not as easy to hate someone who looks like you as opposed to
And
someone who looks and acts different.
and,
Because
and,
at
and that
the
is
end of the
something.
day, that's where white Americans came from. We
Yeah.
came from Germany, England, France.
Exactly. And I think that does color sort of like how we think about the war afterwards, and it's interesting like how sort of like how there's this tendency of going like, well, there's the evil Nazis, and then there's like the regular Germans who for whatever reason went along with it, and then there's like different explanations for that. But I think it does fundamentally sort of like ignore the fact that a lot of like very regular dudes did still go and did horrific fucking shit in both the war and concentration camps and so forth. And those are not necessarily, those people are not insane. It's
So
yeah,
feel free to correct me, right, if
yeah,
I'm wrong, right? I believe, right, that like human beings, we're capable of everything. Like, and not like, I don't think anyone is so good and pure and everything that there
mm,
are things they would never do. I feel like if you put a human being in given the right condition, a human being will do anything. So
Or
I'm
does it
not
fly?
necessarily placing judgment on like
mm,
Japanese as a culture, right?
mm,
I'm just saying that like the conditions, right, that
mm,
their community, their society, like if you understand Japanese culture, it's like they are inclined. I'm just talking of a certain inclination towards doing things like that. Like you know, like America and like Germany, for instance, never had, well, not to my knowledge, they never had like suicide bombers. They never had people that would just like carry a plane and just like dive bomb, just like for maximum effect. I don't know of it. Maybe there is, like,
I was about to say,
I'm
well,
not a
you know,
history
there
buff
is,
like that.
well,
There are suicide missions, right? There are suicide, there are
Yeah.
missions where you know you're going to die, right? But
In the
you're not,
Civil War,
it's
there were
different from, sorry?
in the Civil War there were like
oh,
I don't
really?
know
I
if you've
didn't know
seen
this.
that movie Glory. The people
Mm-hmm.
it's about the Civil War. A lot of times it's kind of like volunteering for the vanguard of like a medieval army, but being that you're facing modern weapons, like your death's going to be pretty bad. So
Yeah, like, but I feel like there's
there are
difference
definitely
between
times
like,
where you're like the first one in, you know you're going to make it, but that wasn't like the point.
so
You
Mm-hmm.
also have
but
like a
then
lot of like very
I feel like there's a
yeah.
difference between cannon fodder and
Yes.
someone in a plane crashing into a thing
Yeah.
for like strategic, like it was
You
a
know, like
thing.
9/11 is much different than like, you know, running out there, you know, like
Yes,
getting yourself
with a
Yeah.
killed.
gun, and like it's like leaving
Uh,
it to chaos to
Yeah.
decide if you
No,
survive or
I know
not.
what you mean,
Like
but
it's
that's the
it's
closest we kind of come to is
like
volunteering for.
these guys cut open their bellies because they shamed. And if you look at the reason as to what some of them considered shame, that's like everyday life for us. That's like so basic. Like
the
I
thing
cannot
is
ignore that cultural like
the thing is
difference.
though that
Like,
you can find the same kind of stuff. Like, well, obviously, seppuku is a very spectacular way of doing it, as is kamikaze. But you have like the code of honor and the kind of things people did in, say, the especially the Prussian side of the German military in the 19th and early 20th century is not that different. It's not swords and that. It's not as spectacular, but like suicides are not unheard of when it comes to shaming there as well. They just like, shot themselves ideally
But
or
I
did
think he
something
means
else.
like the whole point of the mission is that you're going to die to forward the
Yeah,
group.
like what about a lot of, say, the very young people recruited to they're like straight from the Hitler Youth or Hitler Youth battalions that like went to especially the Eastern Front near the end of World War II. A lot of these people did that because they believed in it. They did not just do that because they were told to. Some of them did, certainly, but like you have a lot of like kids
But
volunteering for suicide
were
missions
they
in
going in
or
there knowing that their
Raf,
purpose
that is
was to
pretty
die?
much
different.
yes. Pretty much
that
yes.
is that is still like you're doing that with a group of people. Like you look beside you, you see your comrades to your left, you see your comrades to your right, the fever is there, like you guys are hyping each other up, you guys are trying not to disappoint each other, being in an airplane with the intention alone, with the intention of crashing. Like you do you know, like, consider how many like you're fighting every single human instinct of survival alone.
Yes, but you also do that with lots of threats and lots of brainwashing and all the other stuff behind it. It's not a cultural thing. Most Japanese would not have done that either. If you look up what the kamikaze was and what the kamikaze did, obviously how incredibly useless it was, but it is spectacular. Once again, it is very spectacular, but it is not too far out of the ordinary compared to what some other regimes have done with specifically like young people in their armies. And you have similar things in, once again, the Germany with like Hitler Youth and so forth going to the Eastern Front, where they knew that it was suicide. And you can go like, well, but like being one person in an airplane is different from like being like 20 people. But like, is it though that much? Are you sure? Because if why? And don't come at me with like, well,
Okay.
individualism, because that's not the point. It is not
No,
that big of a difference.
I could tell you this thing. So I was a troubled kid in high school. Like if I
Mhm.
was doing something with my friends, I was a lot bolder. I was like, so like it was like I wasn't the great, like and well, I know that this is high school and everything, but if okay, so like
Mhm.
I'll bring it
even
back.
Sledge talks about it here, right? There was
Yeah.
a sense that everybody thought of themselves as a coward, but
Yes.
they were more afraid of of of
Being
their
seen as a coward
comrades
than being
seen
yeah,
as a
yeah,
coward.
yeah.
So the group mentality is a thing. It's a thing. Doing things in a group is a thing. if there was no one to judge Sledge and some of those soldiers, and they were faced with doing something like that alone, these Japanese guys came like in the middle of the night to like it was obviously an effective tactics, right? But they came in the middle of the night by themselves, you maybe in groups, but they were like spread apart, and that was also kind of like a suicide mission in itself, because how I is the point was to do damage.
Yeah, the point was
They
to
meant
die,
the point was to die, and you were
like
doing
the
it
bonsai
like
attack. I don't
pretty
think
much
they
by
faced bonsai
yourself.
attacks, but
That is different, man. I don't know. Like I think that is like
like, because the
I
Hitler
think
Youth leaving, was their
Mhm.
goal explicitly to die, or did they just know it was going to happen?
Some of them, I mean, some of them clearly the goal was, I mean, obviously the goal was to take out as many people as possible before dying. That's kind of the point. But it was very clear that they were not coming back. And I don't know if there's like much of a difference in like how much of a gradual difference is there. And I don't think it's worth arguing about that, because my point is that it's dangerous to go like they were so beyond. It's like, no, it's what like totalitarian systems do. It's something that you have in like every single like brutal military dictatorship. After a while, that's how radicalizing shit works. Even in
So
like non-governmental versions, that kind of works. You have like suicide
I
bombers
see
for all
where
kinds of
I
terrorist
see where all
Hamas
of you
you know.
guys
with
are
like
coming from.
Imperial Japan, would you see a fundamental difference there?
Between what?
Oh, sorry.
Hamas and Imperial Japan, because
are you asking
well,
me or Raf?
I think he's
both of you,
asking Raph.
all of you.
Raf, go first.
I would argue it depends on what you're looking at. When it comes to
Tactics and suicide bombing in tunnels and all that.
well, I mean, what it's something that people do in despair. I would argue the difference is that the Imperial Army is an occupying army in a lot of these places. Yes, they're fighting like a retreating battle and so forth, but that's like a fundamental difference between why you can't compare that. But like in situations, in radical situations, there people do that, and it doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be whatever ideology it is that kind of drives you to do that. Doesn't really matter, but every ideology can do that. It can be, you know, the imperial ideology of Japan, whether you think of that as religious or not. And I don't think for the most part you can see that as another like religious issue. It's much more at that point in the 1930s. It's much more a political thing, and whether it is the religious aspect of Hamas, and I'm certainly not going to judge that one because I think there's too many sort of like overlapping issues in there as well. Whether it is some of the aspects that you see, say, in communist North Korea, whether it is some of the things you see in, say, I don't know, fucking Rhodesia, whatever. Like, racism can be just as powerful a motivator for that kind of thing as well. Like, if you are in a sort of like very, very brutally authoritarian regime that has one sort of underlying ideology, then people will be willing to do that kind of stuff. That's kind of how that works. It's the same thing you see in like smaller religious cults. You know, that's what what makes people like, you know, drink Kool-Aid, I guess.
It's the thing. I agree with you. You know, it's the thing of ideological possession. Like, you know, when you know what's the quote? You're like, you don't have ideas, ideas have you. You know,
Yeah.
when you're when an idea, like, you know, supersedes your instinct to survive, and it could be triggered by different things, right? Then then it's like and of course you add desperation into that, then you have a concussion of, you know, being willing to do anything.
That's kind of indoctrination is one hell of a drug, and it doesn't really matter what you indoctrinate people into. It's the techniques that kind of do it.
I've read stories like years later that they brought like one guy back and to one of the battlefields, and he like went full bonsai and jumped off a cliff to his death. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard that did happen.
I've heard of Japanese in the tunnels, people finding them in like the 70s and them trying to fight, thinking the war is still going on.
It's like the Japanese are crazy. I'm joking, but like the Japanese are like so hardcore, man. Like there
I
was, I
think
But
think it
yeah,
was
it's
two
like
years
they go
ago they
back.
discovered this guy in an island, and they had to like convince him that the Japanese empire was done. This guy was still like, like living like a dude in the jungle,
but
Yeah,
isn't that isn't that what Rambo First Blood is all about? That you
I
kind
don't
of
know. I haven't seen any of the Rambo movies. But
I
yeah,
think
I've heard
the first one, I recommend the first one,
more
but
than once though. I don't
Yeah,
think
the
it was
first one is
like
good.
one guy. I think they found a few people
yeah.
like decades later and they were like still thinking the war was going on, and when they were trying to be rescued they were getting fought, and I think they even
Yeah.
found an American veteran. I don't know, this is just stuff
Yeah,
I heard.
but that's kind of the point, that if you are in that sort of like extreme situation, you kind of lose a lot of parts of your humanity, and if you're stuck on like one of those fucking islands, like no one's coming by for the next. How would you know the fucking war is over? No one told you.
Exactly.
Yeah,
No,
it's
but
very
it's
Um,
like the
fun fact.
dedication. It's like I'm just like you. Like it's like
I mean, I would think if
this
you
is
walk
what, how many
outside and see
years?
people like
This
cleaning
is
up the
like
dead
50
bodies.
years after. Yeah, like this is like they're still like committed to the course. Like yo, like
Apparently, the
damn.
the last Japanese soldiers on Peleliu did actually come in and capitulate in 1947.
Wow.
So
Yeah, the
You mean
army
even
like
had
they
done.
Peleliu
got
was not
together?
ever
Because
fully
every time I
connected.
think of capitulate, I always think of banging.
I think you're thinking of copulating.
Oh,
That's
sorry.
yeah, that's a difference.
Sorry.
I was for a
Copulating means
second. I'm
like
like,
Alan.
taking advantage.
is it? Is it? Is
I
it
know.
exactly what I think it is?
I know for soldiers, sometimes the difference is hard to understand, but it is there.
I,
No,
well, that's it.
capitulate. Think of like to capitalize on. That's what
Oh,
capitulate.
okay. Well, that was embarrassing.
It's
Yeah, but
okay.
like some
We're
of
all here. We don't care about
the last Japanese soldiers on Peleliu actually came down and got disarmed in like 1947, which I guess makes it probably one of the longest battles in World War II.
This bad Jesus, Britain. Yeah, I kept thinking like, okay, that can't be what that means because like
Yeah.
I don't think they would be
Have
banging
we all
each other.
seen like the
during
images of the naked ladies on the like Navy pilots' planes because they were so sexually frustrated? Like when the Marines would go to Australia, all the Australian people were so angry that they were taking up their women. Like this
Oh,
is a
God.
thing.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful quote in an Ian MacDonald novel: "Just because the sword is a phallic instrument doesn't mean you have to wave it around like a dick."
That's-
I mean,
I like that.
there's that episode of Game of Thrones where they like Tyrion kills a guy with a shield. That episode, and Bronn's like, "Oh, you need a woman. There's nothing like a woman after a battle." And Tyrion looks to Lady Stark and is like,
Yeah,
"I'm willing if she is."
So this was what I was trying to talk about during the last conversation we had. We were talking about chivalric like code and everything, and it was just like when there's war and everything, there's this rush of excitement, and in any way you're trying to find release. I guess there's a thing, there's a narrative on that kind of like influence and motivation.
I think it's care. You need to be careful of your words there, because like a rush of excitement, once again, painted in a very positive way. What it is that you have to divest yourself of.
I spaced out for a moment, but I do know a rush of excitement can lead to erections, like reflex erections.
Yeah,
So
like
I-
Mike Tyson, for instance.
I
My
came back
tax-
when
my
you said rush of excitement because I spaced out for a
like
second.
so
I think
Mike
the
Tyson
the
explained
terminology.
something where, like Mike Tyson explained something like before his fights he was scared he was going to die, and when he was walking to the arena to fight, he used to have erections.
Oh my god.
And
And
that's the kind of excitement I'm talking about, not like
I think it's important to understand that like the word excitement has a positive ring to it, and it's not positive. What it is that in a lot of ways you push back your sort of like, not to go all Freudian on the whole thing, but you not but like that's kind of what it is, right? You sort of like push back your ego and let your id take over in a lot of ways, right? Because that's kind of what you need. You whether it's like fighting, right? You need to rely on your reflexes. You can't think about stuff while you're boxing, right? Obviously, there's like obviously thinking involved, but don't get me wrong. But you have to sort of like reduce that sort of like control that you have over your like over how you act in a lot of ways, and you kind of need to consciously sort of like push that back, and that leads to you losing control of a lot of like things, and it's much more loss of control or than it is like a rush of excitement, because look, that's how a lot of like fucking sexual violence happens in war, because people have to function is actively suppress a lot of like the things that we usually do, because we are humans functioning in a society, and that's what dudes who think that we still can get away with it, which is another thing. But like there is that happening, and calling it a rush of excitement is sort of leaning into that like thing of the sublime that I talked about, where it suddenly sounds like something good, which it is not. And a lot of soldiers behave like absolute fucking
Monsters.
dickheads, to put it mildly.
I think we see a lot of that with Vietnam veterans.
Yeah.
A lot of them came back extremely messed up, more so than, I don't know if it's a generational thing that it could have been a toxic masculinity thing that was dying out
Vietnam,
too.
they actually
but-
saw it on TV and saw
Well,
what it
what I'm
actually
talking about is the veterans.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of them have gone crazy due to the remorse of what they did to like wounded prisoners and civilians and stuff like that. And I don't think we really see as a group, well, partially probably because it wasn't like super urban, we don't see, I don't think, a lot of remorse from the Marines. I was going to say for what they did to Japan, but then I remembered like, oh, there was only one island that they really even fought on that had civilians, so moot point. But
yeah, like and just like to what Ben is saying, this is another reason I have to The Black Company is a masterpiece, man. Like it's one of my favorite books of all time. Like, and I can see so many parallels with just how this memoir is written down, and how like he got it. Like it's like the brilliance of writing to capture that element of prose in your writing is man, like I want to be a writer so bad.
Yeah.
You are a writer.
Amanda.
If you write, you're a writer.
Wasn't the guy who wrote Black Company, wasn't he a veteran?
It's a veteran.
He was a Marine. I don't think he was actually deployed. I'm not quite sure about that part, but like he was very much a Marine and like a soldier for a long time.
You can't
but
be
like
a
what I was
Marine
going
and a soldier at the same time. You got to be a Marine. So like soldiers are in the army, Marines are
okay.
in the
I think it was part of the Marines. I would have to look it up, but like when I say soldier, I mean like someone who's in the larger military forces, because I don't care about fucking American distinctions. Wait, I would call. Look, at the end, maybe that's a German language thing, right? Like, if you are in the Navy, or you're in the Air Force, or you're in the ground forces, you are a soldier. The overarching title is soldier. And that's that distinction between like the Marines and
they take that seriously.
It's not something that comes naturally to German language, because we don't have that. But what I was going to say is, you said like that in the book that much, but there's one key scene that actually looks exactly at that. Is the scene in Okinawa when Sledge goes to that house where that old Okinawan woman is there with the gangrene, and she wants him to shoot him because she's so much suffering. He goes like, no, I'm gonna call a doctor, and then this other soldier just walks past and shoots her, and goes like, well, she asked me to, so I did it. And that's exactly that point where they do exactly, where you see that difference between some people, stepping further outside those bounds of sort of like what you might call human behavior in a lot of ways.
Yeah, again, it kind of reminds me of going back to Things They Carry. It kind of reminds me of that Tim O'Brien quote where it's like, oh, damn. It's a real famous one where he goes, war is defined by its complete allegiance to obscenity and evil. Slight paraphrasing there.
Yeah, which goes back to the question that Amanda was asking earlier. It's like, is war pointless? Is it just like a waste? Because it's like, we can say like, war is, we can find situations where it's like necessary and everything, but even the good guys, like what did they do? What did they participate in? What aspects of their humanity died, and like what, how did that death of humanity like express itself to the good guys, quote unquote, during the war? It's a very very deep question.
Yeah. Also, God's damn it, biggest bad. That was a very bad joke indeed, sir.
What, this is the joke? Joke?
He said, we were talking about Glenn Cook, and he's like, he was a cook, and I'm like,
yeah.
He said he was in the Navy, and okay, so he was in the Navy and was attached to like a Marine force. Like he wasn't a Marine, and he wasn't a corpsman, which is basically a medic. So anytime they say corpsman, they're talking about medics.
Yeah, exactly.
But he wasn't a corpsman, but he was like attached to the 3rd Marine Battalion for a bit. I just looked it up.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Like, I knew he had something to do with Marines, but
Yeah. He wasn't deployed to the war. But like, it just reminds me, like, just you talking about the medic and everything. It makes me think of like the times in the book where like they were going to save people, and they would carry them on these things, and they were scared that they would fall and like die on the rocks or something. But like they were just like trudging away, like while the like the bombs are just like coming and coming and coming. I'm just like, ugh. And so there was a scene where he was talking about when they were so thirsty. And he said for the first time he appreciated the ad of where the dude was saying thirsty, and I was drinking water like right as I was reading that line, and I got chills, man. I got chills.
No, I think there's a lot of situations in that book that work really well. In that it does describe, and that may come back to the whole thing that you were struggling with, I think, Amanda. It is not very literary. And the problem is that if you try to stick to actual reality, that does not necessarily conform to like literary conventions in any way or form. He kind of reflects that near the end, where he goes like, if I were a literary man, I would give this like a proper sort of like ending, that fitting ending or anything. It's like, no, but this is shit happened this way. What can I do? And that can be incredibly frustrating if what you're looking for is like a book that is not fun to read, but like rewarding to read or anything of the sort, because I guess that's not the point. And maybe that's more like the difference between like if you see memoir as a literary genre versus like this is basically a report.
I kept telling myself, I was like, okay, memoir was not what it was now, because a lot of people don't know this. We call memoir is a like subset of creative nonfiction. So it's meant to read like a novel. It's meant to be literary, and it's actually the fastest growing genre. Is memoir, and you read stuff like Wild or The Year of Magical Thinking. It's very literary.
Yeah. This is much closer to what you might call like journalism, like a report, basically.
It does feel like a personal essay.
Yeah. And I think that shows how the genre has shifted in a lot of ways, I think. And the awareness that if you read something that reads like a memoir today, it does very clearly edit reality in a way that makes it conform to like a genre conventions. This book doesn't, which is like why you get like a lot of like boring, repetitive stuff about people sitting in foxholes and being scared and not being able to sleep and having really smelly feet because their shoes are full of water. Again,
that grossed me out. The way he was talking about how every time he took a step, he could feel it squishing. And this is a little bit mean, but both my grandfathers, so one, my dad's dad, was purely World War II because he got wounded. Otherwise, I don't know. He was born in 1925, so would he have had to go to Korea? I don't know. But my other grandfather was in World War II at the very end and then went to Korea. And I remember what his feet looked like.
Yeah.
We'll just leave it there.
Yeah. No. Trench foot is a real problem.
He had trench foot, and also I don't think his boots that were like given out by the Navy really fit him properly.
Yeah.
And it resulted in like really yellow toenails, and
there's an interesting.
I remember the toenails, man.
Yeah, there's an interesting quote in like in the one Terry Pratchett book that is all about the military, which is Monsters Regiment, and it has the wonderful quote: "Look after your feet, and your feet will look after you." And that's like one that's like the their drill sergeant telling the soldiers that, and I'm like, yeah, you got a point. Also, I've been to like way too many heavy metal festivals, especially Wacken Open Air, which is huge, 70, 80,000 people. And it is in some fields in northern Germany, and it often rains. And I've been at that festival like 3, 4, 5 days with like mud that is like up to your knees if you're unlucky. And that is like 4 days, and I can still go back and do something afterwards. But like, yeah, man, mud sucks.
I think I'd rather deal with the
literally.
Mud. I don't know. He does say that Peleliu was worse when he's talking about Peleliu. Which I don't know if that has to do with like the futility of the battle or the sharp coral terrain.
I think it's
they couldn't get like supplies. They couldn't get supplies.
Yeah.
They were dying of thirst. Like the one time they found water, it was poison. Like like that was also his first, because he made a commentary on it as well. He said that
he did
your first war is always the worst.
The beach. It's called, when they first start the invasion, it's called storming the beach. He did that at Peleliu. They didn't do that at Okinawa. That's why I'm like, yeah, it was an invasion, but they didn't storm the beach. All the
and
Japanese soldiers were like back already. They just kind of marched up.
And to be fair, like I think like at the end of the day, being in a brutally hot, dusty place where you can't drink and are constantly dehydrated is worse than being in mud. Mud still sucks though.
Yeah.
None of it is fun. I think that's kind of the point. It's like, well,
yeah,
this was really bad. The other thing was just like worse.
One thing too that I noticed, as opposed to other war stuff I've read, is there's not much focus on camaraderie and brotherhood. It's more about the war as opposed to
it has
experience. But you'd think he would look back and be like, oh, this guy was my wartime brother. I would have moved heaven and earth for him. But that's not in there. He just quickly mentions a few different people.
He does very little of that. I think he kind of does that for his like first captain. I keep forgetting his name. The one he usually calls Skipper. The one that one. And there's a very few others, like Snafu gets like a bit of personality, but like in general, the whole book is, and it almost has like a tunnel vision on just his personal sort of like experience and like what it is to walk around, and it feels like a first-person shooter in a lot of ways, right? You read this and it feels like someone is writing down what he does in like a first-person shooter, like we walk there, I dig a hole, it sucks. We walk to the next place, I dig a hole, it sucks. I wake up in the middle of the night, I have a nightmare. I get up, there's dead people in the palm trees. I walk to the next place, I dig a hole, it sucks. Also, I'm scared, and someone has diarrhea.
So commentary on that, like I feel like out of respect, he wanted to like keep it as honest, and the only way to keep it honest was to talk about like his experience. Like I feel like he was trying to be respectful in doing that, And at the beginning of the book, it talked about how like a lot of soldiers were able to say that, yes, this is what my experience was like.
Yeah.
So I feel like writing, I understand the thing about subjectivity and all of that, but
Mhm.
by writing honestly, just his experience, like it was able to carry that much more effect, because that experience, even though he wrote about it in a singular way, is something that was shared with, that other soldiers can
Oh yeah,
easily
definitely.
say this is authentic. Yeah.
I think I totally agree, and I think what's important to understand is like it is very accurate what he does. I think there's a couple of things that kind of come into this. Like on the one hand, the whole like camaraderie thing is something that I feel is often more part like of the narrativizing thing. The other part is when you look at like how long he's actually in the military, in the war, it's not that long, right? He does the training stuff. We get the whole like training montage. We get like the drill sergeant who's kind of mean. We get the whole thing. Then he goes to Peleliu, and we have like war with it. If you're in a battle, there's not that much room for actually hanging out with your buddies and getting to know each other. And we have that conversation he has with like what's Hillbilly Jones, and we have those small moments, but like there's not that much. And then they came back from Peleliu. They hang out in wherever and Guadalcanal for like a month or two, and then they go to Okinawa, and then it's once again just like slugging through like mud and digging foxholes, and then the book is over. Like when you look at like a lot of the sort of like memoirs, war memoirs, and war narratives that like have like a bigger focus on that, they have way more R&R time to actually get to know each other and do camaraderie stuff. And all we get is like the one moment where what's his face steals the turkey and has like a New Year's party with his friends. That's like the one time we get that. Whereas like if you read something like fucking Storm of Steel, which is like covering like 3 years of fucking World War One, right? Like you have way more time for that. This is not that much of a time. That's like not even one full year of life, right? There's
I
not that
still
much
need
time.
to read Storm of Steel.
Yeah,
No, you shouldn't. It sucks.
Oh.
It makes war. It makes war look incredibly sexy because the guy's an officer, and it still sounds like it's all fun and games and stuff. And then we did this, and then the gentleman from the other side. He's very much on the gentleman side of soldiers in World War One, and obviously not a full Nazi, but very much Nazi adjacent in a lot of ways. So don't read Ernst fucking Jünger.
Okay.
Only the
Yeah, I was
dead
about to
know
say,
that
if
it
I
is war.
recall right, I don't think Raph likes Ernst Jünger very much.
No, I don't. I've read the book though, like twice.
Has anybody read?
Just
I mean,
to
it's
make
hard
sure.
to find in the U.S. It's called Blizzard of Souls. It was made into a book called or a movie called The Rifleman. It's about the Latvian riflemen in World War One.
I have not.
Yeah, it's hard to get your hands on, but the movie's on Amazon. There's the one that's in Latvian, and then there's one that's in English that's dubbed. And yeah, I was just wondering because we were talking about Europe for a second.
No, but I have drunk Finnish vodka with labels that are still commemorating the Winter War. I don't know if that counts.
I don't think so.
Talk about
It was
another
also
nasty
not
war.
a very good vodka, I have to add.
Talk about another nasty war.
Which one have you? Like, all of them are nasty.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but when it's in wintertime and you got a guy called the White Death running around shooting people,
So we've
Now-
been going for almost 2 hours. If you can imagine, the clock says 1:47, almost 1:48. So is there
Here it
anything
says like
else?
11:47 p.m.
Well, no, I'm talking about the timer.
Timer.
Okay,
Oh.
yeah. No, for me, it says like 13 minutes to midnight.
No, it's 4. It's 4:48 here. So we went for a couple hours. Yeah. So is there anything to leave off on? Why don't we just give our star rating of the book? In Britain, we know you just watched The Pacific, but I initially gave this book 2.5 stars. I was not super impressed. But after talking to you guys, I think I'm gonna raise it to 3.5. So
Sorry. So when I initially saw your rating, I was so confused. I was just like, wait, like, what is she rating 2.5? Like his experience or like,
Yeah.
you know?
yeah,
I was about to say it's always awkward, like trying
I'll
to
go
rate
into
a
Goodreads right
memoir
now and
'cause
change it.
Yeah.
it's like a
Yeah.
guy talking about his
No,
experiences. You know?
but just knowing
Let's make
Amanda,
that a 2.5, Sledge.
just just knowing Amanda, I completely understand why, like, she
Yeah.
should look at things from a literary perspective. I mean, she's a
I just,
teacher.
I just think of it like as like an Airbnb rating. Pelelio 2.5 stars. Would not recommend.
Okay, there we go. 3.5. Dave. Okay.
You know,
Epic, you
um,
didn't finish, but what do you think your rating's gonna be?
so I have to, like, everyone knows I'm a fan of Grimdark, and I'm not even like but like this book made me understand why, like, when I read books, I don't necessarily like to feel good about, like, I don't like a
Yeah,
warm
yeah.
fuzzy
You
feeling,
just want to
you
feel
know.
something. You don't
I
necessarily
want
want
to feel, something that is like real, like
to.
truth, like in its most visceral form. So, like, I really enjoyed the realism of the book, just like how drudgy and how honest his experience felt. So I would give it a 3.5 as well.
Awesome.
Um,
Great.
well, I only
So,
watched the Pacific.
yeah.
I haven't. Oh, sorry. I thought
Go
you were
ahead.
talking
No.
to me.
Go ahead.
Well, I only watched Pacific, and now I kind of want to read the book now. But
Yeah.
I liked
Good.
Pacific. It's not as good as Band of Brothers, but I liked it a
Oh
lot.
no. I think it's better, but that's okay.
I think it's from what I can from what I can tell, it is
I'm a little
way
biased.
more
I'll admit.
historically accurate than Band of Brothers, which is kind of the point. Which is probably why it sucks because life does not necessarily make for good narratives, as we have
Nope.
discovered.
My favorite flub in Band of Brothers is when they say, "Oh, Hitler's dead," and it's April 12th. I'm like, Hitler was
Is
not
it?
dead at that
I
time.
didn't miss it.
So funny. I'm just like, how did you miss that? Oh.
All
Well,
right.
rumors of his death were greatly exaggerated at the time.
All right, Rafe.
I don't do star ratings.
Uh,
What did you think of it?
No, look, I'm glad I read it. I've learned a lot of stuff. It made me think, which is all good. And I've read the Old Testament twice now. I'm not complaining about repetitive narratives of slaughter. It's something I've done before.
okay. All right, guys. So this was a lot of fun. Thank you for the people who turned in. We actually had more viewers than I thought. I didn't think anybody was going to care, but it's good to know that you do care. And World War II veterans are dying out. My grandfathers are dead. The last World War II veteran I met was 97 years old. So I am not a huge fan of the American military. But if you do see a World War II veteran out there, you don't have to thank them, but let's try to make conversation because they deserve it.
Yeah, you learn something specific that memory gets lost is kind of the point. It's like whether
Well,
it's,
that's what's called memoir. It comes from the word memory.
I have had French in school. I could guess, But yeah, no, that's the point. It's like anyone who has lived through those times, it's worth talking to. Whether it's Holocaust survivors, whether it's World War II veterans, from either side, it's important to sort of like know what those people survived because narratives are shaped by the stuff that is left behind, and that may depend on who has the privilege to actually get heard and get to tell the stories. So talking to people is always helpful.
All right. So with that, I'm gonna end the stream. Thank you, Biggest Bad, for being here.
Thank you,
And let's
Ben.
hit that button, and we will wait during the awkward pause.